The Kiowa lived for centuries on the Great Plains, hunter-gatherers who, like many tribes in the region, relied on the bison hunt for their way of life. Like the neighboring Comanche and Plains Apache, the Kiowa were one of the mighty warrior tribes of the Great Plains. These three people eventually formed an alliance that fiercely resisted against the United States government. But one warrior changed everything. Sitting Bear was one of the most fearsome Kiowa warriors, and that didn't change when the government arrested him. Facing certain death, Sitting Bear came up with a jaw-dropping plan to get even. The American bison was one of the most important food sources for the Kiowa on the Great Plains. Before the introduction of horses, hunters would trek bison on foot. The Kiowa became masters of the bison hunt, but it could be a treacherous business. Hunting one-ton bison on foot is no easy business, and it required Kiowa hunters to get as close as possible without the animal becoming aware of their presence. To help disguise their approach, Kiowa hunters would sometimes wear animal pelts on their backs, blending in with the environment until it became time to pounce. Hunters would get as close as possible before firing their arrows, or they'd even get close enough to strike at the bison with a long spear. Bison provided material for most of the Kiowa's needs, especially before the arrival of the Europeans. Bone was used for tools, and hides were used to make everything from bags to robes to jugs for cooking and drinking. Since the Kiowa relied so heavily on the bison for sustenance, they had to be ready for the follow of the herds wherever they went. They lived a nomadic existence, able to carry nearly everything they needed with them. The Kiowa exist today as the Kiowa Indian tribe of Oklahoma, but they originate in Montana and Colorado. At their peak, they controlled vast territories all across the Great Plains. The Kiowa lived in teepees, tall lodges that could easily be broken down and carried with them when the tribe had to move on, though they could be broken down and packed within minutes. Teepees could be up to 25 feet tall. They usually had one entrance flap and a flap at the peak for smoke to escape. The floors of a teepee would be covered in animal pelts and furs to provide warmth and comfort. Kiowa women were extremely skilled artists and textile makers, and teepees were usually covered with intricate designs, often inspired by nature. Artists also made beautiful designs for clothing, bags, and more. Kiowa designs tend to be incredibly colorful, with a particular preference for red, orange, yellow, blue, and black. Like many other tribes from the Great Plains, the Kiowa used dogs as pack animals before the introduction of horses, either with packs on their back or by dragging sled-like contraptions called travois. One of the roles of the Kiowa woman was to care for the tribe's dogs. In fact, dogs and travois sleds were exclusively owned by women. Kiowa men wore skin shirts, moccasins, breechcloths, and leggings, while women wore skin dresses, knee-length moccasins, and poncho-like tops. Feathered headdresses or fur caps were also a styling option. Kiowa women would paint their hair and faces, pierce their ears, and sometimes even get tattoos. Kiowa men were mostly involved in the production of weapons and tools, and they had many different kinds. Bows, arrows, spears, tomahawks, war clubs, and knives were just some of the weapons the Kiowa might make, plus tools like saws, scrapers, and needles. A Kiowa warrior shield was very important to them. They were made of bison hide stretched over a small wooden frame. They would then adorn them elaborately with feathers, furs, teeth, claws, and paint. Monogamy was the most common form of marriage, but men could occasionally take a second wife. Divorce was possible, if not common, though the punishment for adultery was horrific, and you would not believe what they did. If a Kiowa man caught his wife with another man, he could either kill her or cut off her nose. And yes, that is very extreme, but for the Kiowa, they took monogamy extremely serious. Though the bison were the Kiowa's most important food source, hunters would also catch antelope, deer, and other wild game, along with fruits, berries, tubers, and vegetables that they would gather. There were strong food taboos in Kiowa culture. Though they ate bison, deer, and other game, they refused to eat bear, fish, or birds. Generally, Kiowa men tended to hunt and women tended to gather, but this wasn't a firm social rule. Women could hunt if they wanted to, and vice versa. Kiowa cuisine featured a lot of bison meat, and they cooked it in many different ways, including roasting, boiling, and drying. On certain occasions, they also might consume some parts raw. Dried meat could be used as calorie-rich food called pemmican. The dried meat is ground into a powder, then they mix equal parts fat or tallow, with other ingredients occasionally added. Horses first arrived in Central America with the Spanish. Eventually, the Kiowa acquired horses of their own, likely by raiding Spanish rancheros south of the Rio Grande. Gaining access to horses changed Kiowa's cultures forever. On horseback, hunters could approach a bison at full speed and pierce it through their heart. But it wasn't just the bison hunt that the introduction of horses changed. It also changed the way the Kiowa warriors fought. Like many other tribes in the Great Plains, the Kiowa had a fierce warrior culture. And once horses became available, almost all fighting was done on horseback. Horses also allowed the Kiowa to begin conducting long-distance raids against the Spanish and other tribes. The Kiowa were particularly aggressive during the horse culture era of the Great Plains. Their raiding made enemies of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Navajo, Ute, and Lakota tribes. They also fought the Pawnee, the Osage, and the Wichita, among others. Kiowa believed that death was closely associated with dark spirits. They strongly believe in ghosts and other dark spirits that could haunt the land of the living. This made their rituals for the end of life incredibly visceral. When a member of the tribe passed, their family was expected to loudly exclaim their grief by wailing, ripping off their clothes, and even shaving their head. There's even record of self-laceration in these moments. Members of the tribe would then clean the body and bury it as fast as they could, even the same day if possible. The belief was that a quick burial reduced the chances of evil spirits haunting the burial site. After a person passed, the Kiowa would then burn nearly all of their belongings, along with their teepee. Just like they say, you can't take it with you. Kiowa warriors would go on spiritual vision quests. The spirits would then grant them special powers, which they would depict on their shield. These shields held incredible spiritual power for the Kiowa, and could stay in a family for generations. The extended family was of great importance to the Kiowa, siblings in particular. Family groups were usually led by the oldest brother, and the brothers and sisters might stay together for the entire lives. The Kiowa followed an elected chief, called the Topadaki, who proved themselves based on bravery, intelligence, experience, and charisma. Topadaki had power and influence, but they weren't a king. They led mostly by consensus, and had to convince the band that their reasoning was sound for everything they did. There were many different shield societies among Kiowa warriors, but if you wanted to join one, you had to earn it. For example, to join the oldest of the shield societies, the Tame, you had to prove you're wealthy by presenting valuable gifts to the Tame keeper. The Tame Shield Society was the oldest, but the Eagles were just as, if not more, powerful. It's said that a warrior with Eagle Shield was invulnerable in battle, and the legendary Kiowa chief Sitting Bear was a leader of the society. Not all societies were hard to get into. The Little Rabbit Society was for boys, and all young Kiowa men were automatically a part of it before they grew up and moved on to different societies. Once Kiowa boys grew up, they would likely try to get themselves noticed in battle, so one of the shield societies would invite them to join. But being in the Little Rabbits had nothing to do with fighting. It served to socialize and educate young boys, rather than to train them for warfare. If you were a member of the Buffalo Shield Society, that meant you were essentially a Kiowa medic. The Buffalo specialized in healing wounds and broken bones. According to legend, the society was founded by a woman, but after her, all the members had to be men. Drawing on the powerful sight of an owl, members of the Owled Shield Society communed with spirits to answer questions or foresee the future. In battle, these members would paint themselves white with blue owl designs on their chest. A society of women that harnessed the power of the bear was something to be feared. After all, the bear was considered dangerous and taboo in Kiowa society. However, it was also believed that the woman of the Bear Society created the most powerful medicines in the tribe. The Koitsenko, or real dogs, only ever had 10 members. But these were the 10 greatest warriors from the entire Kiowa tribe, as elected by all members of each band. Each members of the Koitsenko wore a black and red sash to denote their status, while the leader of the group had their own spotted antelope sash. The highest status people in Kiowa society were called the Onde, and these were great warriors, important chiefs, and spiritual leaders. Then came the Adegupa, including lesser chiefs, medicine men, and prominent warriors. After the Adegupa came the Khan, or mediocre ones. These were essentially commoners, and they made up about half the tribe. But there was still one class of people below them. Dapon means nobodies. People that Kiowa considered mad, or at least so divergent from the Kiowa values that they might as well be mad, were deemed Dapon, and they sat at the very bottom of the Kiowa society. As Europeans arrived and Kiowa land started shrinking, a third group arose, the Wild Mustang Kiowa, who were part of the final resistance against the white settlers. Kiowa bands would gather together in large camps during the winter. Then when spring came, they would spread across the plains. Then when the bison arrived, they would join back together for the hunt. In late June or early July, all the Kiowa bands would come together for an annual Sundance, which included complex rituals, ceremonial hunts, and a chance to disparate members of the tribe to reconnect. Kiowa society was loosely divided into bands, each of which joined the teepee ring at their annual Sundance ritual. Though there could be up to 40 loose bands at a time, the main divisions in the teepee ring were the biters, the elks, and the big shields, thieves, Senda's children, and pulling up. When the teepee circle formed the Sundance, the topadoki from each band would gather to discuss issues pertaining to the Kiowa as a whole. One of the most important ceremonies during the Sundance was the remains of the gourd dance. Men adorn their shoulders with elaborate blue and red blankets and wear bandoilers made of silver beads and red skunk berries. The red juice of the berries representing the blood of the fallen Kiowa warriors. While drummers beat and sing, dancers from a large circle around them, the men in the circle with feathered fan in one hand and a rattle in the other, dance to the beat of a drum, lifting their feet in time to the drum beats. The first song tends to be slower, building to a frantic fever pitch by the last song. Though the US government actively banned Kiowa culture ceremonies for many years, the Kiowa gourd dance saw a resurgence in the 20th century. Today, many tribes perform the gourd dance at powwows, with their own traditions, though most of them do not have approval of Kiowa elders. The Sundance was also an opportunity for warriors from different bands to join up with the members of the shield societies, and the societies had their own rituals and responsibilities during the ceremony. Kiowa raids into Spanish territory gave them access to more horses, but they also acquired firearms, slaves, and metal instruments from the Europeans. The Spanish arrival in North America changed Kiowa culture long before they knew they were pushed out of their lands. Things like horses and firearms, which were in very limited supply, completely changed the Kiowa concepts of wealth and status. As soon as they were introduced, horses became integral to Kiowa society. They allowed the Kiowa to greatly expand their range and influence, and the animals became integrated into many aspects of Kiowa life. Soon, the Kiowa were considered the most skilled horsemen on the Great Plains. Horses were still new to the continent, and there were never enough to go around. When the Kiowa raided other tribes, the number one thing they wanted was more horses. A Kiowa man's wealth was measured in his herd of horses. The Kiowa would adorn their horses with body paint from medicine men, both for ritual purposes and for protection in battle. The Kiowa also adorned their animals with elaborate beaded masks, sometimes with buffalo horns attached. The Comanche were another powerful, warlike tribe in the Great Plain regions. You might think this would be a problem, but the Kiowa and Comanche actually formed an alliance that made both of them nearly unstoppable, and it persisted until well into the 20th century. The Plains Apache eventually joined the alliance with the Kiowa and the Comanche, and these three tribes proved a powerful force against both encroaching white settlers from the northeast and Mexican soldiers from the south. Though raids were a normal part of Kiowa society, their position on the Great Plains was also perfect to take part in intricate trade network that existed in the region. Kiowa raids against other tribes became even more lucrative when they first made contact with English and the French, with whom they would trade for guns, ammunition, and other European commodities. White settlers beginning to arrive in the Great Plains en masse in the early 19th century led to a conflict called the Kiowa Wars. and the tribe fought fiercely against the invaders alongside their allies, the Comanche and the Apache. The most legendary Kiowa Topadoki was Dohasan, who led the Kiowa for over 30 years in the 19th century. His name meant Little Mountain, and he was born to a mercantile band of Kiowa in the Upper Missouri Valley in the late 18th century. Before becoming Topadoki, Dohasan made a name for himself as a daring and devious warrior. He rose to become one of the elite Koitsenko before being named chief. Warfare on the Great Plains could be brutal. Before Dohasan, a man named Adate was Topadoki, but in 1833, the members of his village were brutally slaughtered by Osage raiders in a raid while Adate and his warriors were away on a bison hunt. Soon after the atrocity, the elders deposed Adate and named Dohasan the new Topadoki. The most infamous moment of Dohasan's unprecedented 30-year run as Topadoki was when he led the combined forces of the Kiowa, Comanche, and Plains Apache at the First Battle of Adobe Wells, the largest engagement fought between Native Americans and the U.S. government on the Great Plains. Satank, or Sitting Bear, was another legendary Kiowa warrior and medicine man, a leader of the Koitsenko while Dohasan was chief. Sitting Bear led countless raids against both other tribes and U.S. outposts. William Tecumseh Sherman became well acquainted with Sitting Bear after the Warren Wagon train raid in 1871. He eventually had Sitting Bear and two other tribal leaders arrested and planned to try them for murder in Jacksboro, Texas, the first time ever a Native American had been tried in a white man's court. Sitting Bear had no intention of being humiliated in a white man's court. He had to be forced into the wagon, at which point he told some Kiowa scouts to tell his family they'd find his body on the road to Jacksonville. And to this day, no one can believe what Sitting Bear did next. While en route, Sitting Bear hid his head under a blanket and began singing the death song of the Koitsenko. The singing eventually stopped and the guards couldn't see what he was doing next. Under the blanket, Sitting Bear managed to gnaw his wrist down to the bone, just enough to get off his restraints. He managed to get a knife, attack one guard, and get his rifle before the other guards ended him with a volley of shots. The guards then took Sitting Bear's body and threw it over to the side of the road, just as he had predicted. As the 19th century drew to a close, there was no longer room on the Great Plains for the great Kiowa warriors like Sitting Bear and Dohasan. Like many tribes, the Kiowa at large were relocated to lands in Oklahoma, but not all of them were willing to go. Roaming bands of Kiowa warriors eluded capture and remained at large in the Great Plains until as late as 1875. But they were all either forced into Oklahoma or driven to extinction by the U.S. Army. Kiowa were some of the earliest Native Americans to gain recognition in the Western world, being commissioned to create works for international exposition as early as 1891. Kiowa artists traditionally painted on hides, as can be seen on their elaborate and colorful parfleche bags. But as their way of life was changed, they no longer had the same access to hides. But they did have access to old accounting ledgers that no one was using anymore. Soon, ledger art was born. Ledger art was created out of necessity as the Kiowa way of life was taken from them. The first known ledger artists were Kiowa warriors who were captured and imprisoned by American forces. These early artists, a bridge to the Kiowa Pass, were followed by a group called the Kiowa Six, who studied at the University of Oklahoma and whose work was exhibited all around the world. The Kiowa lived on the reservation until 1906. In the late 1800s, they were deceived by the U.S. government and sold 2.5 million acres of their land, which they would never get back. The Kiowa Tribal Council has governed the tribe ever since 1968. There are over 12,000 members registered with the tribe today, many living in Caddo, Comanche, Cotton, Jackson, Kiowa, Tillman, Greer, and Harmon counties of Oklahoma. So what do you think of the Kiowa tribe and Sitting Bear? Is Sitting Bear one of the most fiercest warriors of all time? And would you be brave enough to chew your wrist down to the bone to escape handcuffs just like Sitting Bear did? And do you think what he did was worth it? Let us know in the comments below and we can have a discussion. But remember to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.